an unusually full and stimulating day. If you feel if you don't feel overstimulated now, then you never will. There's a huge amount that we've discussed here, and hopefully ideas that have kind of crashed in from different directions. Keir Milburn, I don't know if he's still there, he is, had a lovely tweet saying something like, this is such a kind of fast-moving debate, there's a sense sometimes that we're only imperfectly gripping it from our different kinds of backgrounds, disciplinary backgrounds and so on. But that's what makes it such an interesting discussion, right? It's not ossified at all. This is a very open and very fluid set of debates. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to chair the last session with an amazing lineup, an almost too good to be true lineup. But nevertheless, here we are. And so what I've done with our final group is to give them the broadest possible title: Local Justice and Beyond, the Future of Radical Local Government, which is basically permission to talk about whatever they'd like to talk about. Right, reflections on today, thoughts for the future, where does this debate go from here? Whatever our five final speakers would like to talk about will be absolutely fine. And as we think, here in the first week of 2019 about how this debate develops over the year ahead. So we have, from our speakers, first of all, we'll have Matthew Brown, a man without whom the Preston model wouldn't exist. What an extraordinary thing to say. Many of you will have seen that the PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, do an annual good growth index, and Preston, Lancashire, is Britain's most improved city in terms of somewhere to live, according to Now, Matthew is too modest to take any credit for that, but I think we should look past his modesty, and I'm sure that the work that he and his colleagues have been doing has a large part to do with that. We then have Asima Shaikh from Islington, the Executive Cabinet Member for Inclusive Economy and Jobs, and a member of the Labour Party's Community Wealth Building Unit, constituted in the Leader's office, who will be able to give us a perspective from, I guess often in these debates about local justice, right, London is the kind of exotic other against which I'm an adopted northerner now, so London is now forever in my head, that London, right, against which we sort of position ourselves, but yet this agenda also lives in London too, so it'd be good to hear about how in that different kind of environment this sort of agenda would work. We'll then have Hilary Wainwright, who I think I can say without fear of any exaggeration whatsoever, is a legendary figure in British socialism and in British feminism, a former economic advisor to the Mayor of London during the period of the GLC, the founding editor of Red Pepper magazine, and the author of New Politics from the Left, among many other books, but Hilary, I think, may even have some copies for sale of her excellent new book from Policy Press, which I thoroughly recommend. We'll then have Jo Guinan, who chaired the third session, the Executive Director of the Next System Project and Vice President of the Democracy Collaborative, which we've heard about today. Jo is an incredibly Stakhanovite in terms of productivity, and has 2 books coming out in 2019. A book called People Get Ready, Preparing for a Corbyn Government, co-authored with Christine Berry, which is coming out in a few months from OR Books. And then a little bit later in the year, when it's finished, The Case for Community Wealth Building, co-authored with me, coming out from Policy Press. So there's all sorts of goodies coming out from Jo later this year. And then we'll finish with James Meadway, another man currently wrestling with a book, currently on book writing sabbatical, but a former chief economist and the New Economics Foundation, which we've heard about today from Francis, but in his day job, once the book is finished, economic advisor to the Shadow Chancellor. So I'm absolutely overjoyed that this group all said yes to coming, and here we are, and I'll hand over to Mackie.
Okay, thanks all for bearing with us throughout the day, and I hope everyone had a very relaxing Christmas break, and welcome to back into the new year. So, yeah, I think there's some certain trends that we discussed today, and I think there's like key trends, and the key trends are about the systemic problem we have with the capitalist economy, which is something that isn't a UK issue, it's actually an international issue. And that is what's kind of like inspiring me about how these trends are seeing these responses, which are growing in a number of different places, both in the UK but in America's cities and elsewhere. But this isn't just a recent thing, this is a thing that happened nearly 50 years ago. If you look back to some of the foreign policy interventions, like the overthrow of Salvador Allende by a CIA-backed military coup, imposing a form of capitalism on the Chilean people who basically didn't want it, and getting rid of democracy there. It's all part of the same neoliberal agenda that we've had for the last 45 years, and that was an extreme version of it, but obviously within the UK and the US we had Thatcherism and Reaganism. So what we're responding to is that very ingrained way of thinking that's actually a global economic way of thinking and way of doing things. It's just spread out around the world. But what is actually bringing us to potentially a new system is that economic crash of 10 years ago, and John McDonnell refers to it very eloquently, about how everyone within the UK had to pay £20,000 per family to support the banking system that was bailed out, and that was part of this very unstable free market economy that was actually, say, an international situation with money, with stocks and shares and derivatives being bought up every seconds, minutes and hours and days, and not any stable investment within the economy. And then we had the economic crash, and from that we've had austerity. And you've seen the devastating effects of austerity in the last 10 years. It's the 120,000 deaths, it's the cuts to social care, it's having to work till you're 68 to get your pension in the public sector, and also the economic response we're getting with the way the banking system's operating, even though it's been bailed out. It's not lending to local businesses, it's not lending to local communities, it'd rather invest in other financial firms that tend to be international firms, again, which speculate or invest in real estate. We've got a situation in Preston, and all this is very big picture stuff, obviously, and then going to the little city of Lancashire, Preston, which I'm really privileged to be a leader on now, but that hit us because we did the conventional things, or we were told to do the conventional things. So, back in the late 90s, two of the largest developers in the world, one called Lend-Lease Leighton, before that Grosvenor, which was the Duke of Westminster's company, said we're going to come in and we're going to regenerate the city. And this would have been a development vehicle in which half of the assets of Preston, the city centre, we put into this development vehicle, which would have been semi-privatised. And we're told by doing that, we're bringing all this in with investment, £700 million, so we get a Marks and Spencer's, we get a John Lewis, we get housing, we get a cinema, and then it was problematic. So for the first 5 or 6 years, there was issues with the planning system, there was Blackpool and Blackburn nearby that said it's going to threaten our viability, and then when the economic crash came, the whole system had to be abandoned. So you're in a situation where we took over as a Labour Council in 2011, where we waited 13 or 14 years for inward investment, quite significant inward investment. We've all been told it's going to happen, it's going to be the magic bullet that will regenerate our city, and then that falls through. And not only do you have that going on, you've also got a situation where there's a worldwide economic crash, and you've also got an austerity agenda. So the government's giving you less and less. So you've got a double whammy. So the Preston model, quite significantly, did actually come from that systemic failure of the system as it is. So we thought again. So what we've done is we've tried to look at all the different aspects of economic democracy and community wealth building, which we feel can potentially be transformative. We try and put it all together in Preston. Now, Preston is work in progress. As Neil has said, this is a wealth building agenda that's happening in Islington, it's Southampton, it's in a number of places. And Preston's a perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We've got austerity, we've got child poverty, but we do feel we're moving in the right direction, and the trends show that by applying these ideas together, we're moving in the right direction. So I'll just mention a few things. We've got 60 living wage employees within Preston now who are paid a real living wage of £9 an hour. That includes the majority of the local public sector, the anchor institutions. So when they're buying goods and services locally, we're managing to get the living wage expanded there. So that's a real achievement. So out of a city of 120,000, we've got 60 living wage employers. We, as a Labour administration, we supported a new credit union. We're invested in a community development financial institution, very common in America though, so they're lending to businesses and individuals within our deprived areas. Our public pension fund is choosing to invest 100 million within Preston and Lancashire, so that's 3% that's been taken from global equities and is going to be put back into our local economy there. We've refurbished our new markets in municipal ownership, and we've got planning policies which say that on all developments in the public and private sector of a certain size, we encourage local labour and local suppliers. And also through planning we get at least 30% affordable housing and housing developments. We've also expanded our cooperative economy. We've helped establish a Preston Cooperative Development Network. We've got 2 worker-owned businesses at the moment. The first one's actually going to be in one of the buildings outside Preston Town Hall. And it's going to be a worker co-op that's actually a food cooperative, and then we've got an IT one as well which is being established. We've got more on the way. But the idea is these gaps in our local procurement, where a lot of these public wealth in goods and services is leaking down to Greater London and the South East, we want to fill them by creating a number of worker-owned businesses. So what is really fascinating is how, in many places in our economy, there's an illusion of democracy. So you stand to be a Labour councillor or a Green or Liberal or Conservative councillor, and someone like myself gets in the cabinet and you lead the City Council eventually. What you find is you actually get this power and people vote you in, but democracy is in many ways is an illusion because of the amount of wealth extraction, the very little democratic control local government has these days on how to actually try and promote a democratic agenda around the economic development, because it's often outside investors that you're just told you have to attract. You can't have any ideology, you can't have any strategy. All you're told to do is try to bring in big investors, a lot of big corporations often, which can often cause a lot of damage to the community. And that's been the culture in local government for the last 20 or 30 years, and I think it's a big part of this neoliberal agenda that's been going on for so long. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring back that democracy, and we're being quite successful at it at the moment. And it's a real eye-opener because with Neil, myself and Neil and others went round the heads of our anchors and said we want to buy more from local suppliers in Preston and Lancashire. But what we found is that out of the 75 million that we brought back to the Preston economy in 2016-17, that's almost been entirely at the expense of large companies and corporations that are headquartered in Greater London and the South East. So that's not small businesses in Islington or Croydon or wherever. It's the large multinationals like Sodexo and Brake Brothers and all the rest of them. That's the wealth that we brought back into our communities, and it just shows what a straitjacket we're in, because the culture's been that the public sector buys from all these large corporations, and then it ends up down in the square mile, often ends up in a tax haven potentially, and we've got to stop that. And that's why Preston has been very successful so far around the procurement side of what we've done. But some of the figures, we're now the best out of Lancashire people who work here who receive the real living wage of £9 an hour or more. We've got 20% of people who receive less than it. Other parts of Lancashire, it's about 38 or 40%. We feel a lot of the policies have led to that. The number of employees within Preston, that's increased from 58% to 72%. So we've added 13,000 employees in a small city out of a workforce of about 80,000 now. Crucially, self-employment's less than half the national average, so people have employment contracts as an employment relationship that actually is coming through these policies. We've improved the social mobility index, and as Martin said, we were independently voted by PricewaterhouseCoopers Demos the most improved city to live and work in the UK. So these are independent indicators which shows that we're doing this. And a lot of people on potentially the right wing of the Labour Party or in opposition parties will say this is down to conventional economic development, but we have had our own fair share of conventional economic development within Preston, still do, but other areas which have policies like city deals and growth deals, there's lots of them, and we've improved a lot more than those areas as well in that index. But going further, we really want to go a lot further. So for example, be working with our anchor institutions and other councils to establish a community bank, potentially at a regional level. And that's really important because 85% of people put the money in major banks like Barclays and NatWest and Santander, Royal Bank of Scotland, that arguably caused this mess in the first place. That is again leaking down to the square mile, ended up in a tax haven. So we're becoming poorer by not setting up these alternatives. And the political culture, even now with Jeremy Corbyn, is one in which often at a local level, if I go to the Labour leader and say, let's establish our own bank, they'll say, oh, you sure you want to do that? What do you want to do that for? But it's essential that we actually have these new models to actually challenge the dominance of a neoliberal economy and a deregulated economy. So we're working on that. We hope to have the community bank up and running within the next 24 months. We've got 7 million so far from other councils and other organisations, so that is essential, and we're working on that at the moment. As I say, we've got a number of worker on cooperatives now that are springing up. We're aiming to have 10 or 15 worker co-ops, and a big part of that, which will be to stop the tens of millions that are leaking down to large companies that are headquartered in Greater London and the South East, often shareholder-owned firms. Things like social care potentially, food again, furniture. There's not a company in Preston that sells furniture to the local public sector at all. Let's create one in worker ownership so it's rooted in the community. And what's interesting about touring the evergreen co-ops is in doing contracts that are worth $2 million or $3 million, you're talking about 50 people in these cooperatives. And how much of this public wealth is out there going to large outsourcing firms, or potentially it could go into more sustainable enterprises like local businesses or cooperatives, which keep a lot more wealth in the community. We want to do that. The pension funds, as I said, the public pension fund is investing within Preston and Lancashire. Now I'm leader of Preston Council, I want to go further. I want to look at having a Lancashire wealth fund, so it's not just public pension fund wealth that's going in there, it's other investments from councils and universities, it's assets. We can have a pool of wealth potentially worth about £700 million or more in Lancashire that could be democratically controlled and directed to put into things like housing or renewable energy or supporting small businesses or whatever it is. And it's money that's in our community anyway, because ironically, the amount that's been invested in the UK by public sector pension funds has fell from 60% to 30% over the last 30 years. Again, it seems part of the economic trends that we have, that there's all the wealth extraction, often in places where we don't know where the money's going or where the investments are, etc., etc., etc. And then we'll get more directly involved in housing again as an authority, potentially establishing a company, potentially with our cooperative housing association. So have a public co-op partnership to develop housing, we're looking at that as well. Our university's looking at new technology. We're looking at a civic drone centre so we can actually use drone technology, which will be worth £32 billion to the UK economy by 2030. We want to have a civic drone service, which again, potentially will be a cooperative, and actually have the drones produced by the local SMEs and potentially our aerospace industry, because they're currently produced within China. And then crucially as well, we're looking at things around local hiring, because these institutions, like our hospital in Preston, 4,500 employees, what I bet they're not doing is looking through the postcodes and saying, are we hiring from the areas of the highest levels of unemployment and the highest levels of deprivation? Because it's them that actually need living wage jobs. Because obviously there's a big link between social determinants of health and inequality. Now again, what is even more exciting about all of this is how these ideas and how these responses to that systemic problem are actually spreading across the United Kingdom. So Neil's mentioned also about Islington, Kirklees and Wirral, but also crucially, we now got Mark Drakeford in Wales, the Welsh First Minister. He's very much behind the community wealth building agenda. In Scotland you've got Richard Leonard, and councils in Scotland that want to do it, and there's other places as well that are looking to do this and expand it. But we've really got to get to a situation where this becomes the mainstream, because I don't want to be in a situation where I'm skirting around the edges. This work is stressful enough anyway, it's challenging enough. I don't want to be in a situation in 10 years' time where we've actually lost this opportunity, and I think that's really important. But what we have with us is the amount of people who want to do this. Like there's 6 areas within the UK now that want to establish a regional cooperative bank. I said Mark is behind the RSA model of community banking as an alternative within Wales. And again, the American cities, you go to America, the fascinating thing about going to America is New York City. They're saying we want to support worker-owned cooperatives, especially in the Bronx and areas like that. We've got people of colour who the economic system is not working for them. Los Angeles, they're saying let's establish a public bank because they realise Wall Street isn't working for their community there. But finally, it's a bit of a plea to what Neil said basically, as academics and politicians and whatever, we can understand what the problem is. We've got huge inequality. We've got life chances that are ruined by it, but we've actually got to do something about it. You know what I mean? So, I know what Francis said about us being part of a rock concert. We've got to make sure we sing like the Bee Gees in harmony. All going in different places and end up part of some kind of weird John Cage composition. So, these are exciting times, and maybe what we're seeing from all this systemic decay of the economic model is the beginnings of a new economic model, which might in 30 years' time be on capitalism, which I think has actually shown that it's actually does need to be replaced gradually by something more democratic and more sustainable. And that ain't going to be returned to the former Eastern Europe. It's going to be something quite new and modern and socialist in a way that's extremely democratic and evolved. And we've got to get to that place. And as I said, we've all got responsibility in this thing to make it happen. And it can happen. And it needs to happen, because if we don't offer substantial choices for our community, it opens up opportunities to like a Donald Trump, who will actually use the inequality we have to actually pander to prejudice and things that we really want to avoid about negativity in our society, blaming people all the time, which is toxic and has happened by right-wing politicians traditionally. So thanks a lot for listening, and thanks for staying with us for all the day, and hope that all makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for staying to the end of the day, and thank you, Martin, for inviting me. I always enjoy talking about Islington and sharing some of the experiences that we've gone through in developing our version of the municipalism, or municipal socialism. I've really enjoyed today. What's been really helpful for me is what's been drawn out and been highlighted are some of the gaps and some of the constraints on the community wealth building agenda, and highlighting where the direction of travel is as well. I normally start off these sessions. I've shared the platform with Matt and Hilary a few times. I normally start by saying that when you think of Islington, you don't really think that we have a problem in wealth building or wealth creation. By traditional measures, we're not a left behind place, and the economy is not in decline in Islington. But the issues of social and economic justice cut to the heart of our wealth building challenge in Islington. Islington, possibly like many other inner city, large metropolitan areas, we're not challenged in our ability to create wealth, but rather the challenges that we face that are in our ability to determine the kinds of wealth created, the control that we have over it, and how it's distributed. So our challenge is that we have wealth that is right next to inequality, poverty, and deprivation. It exists side by side, and sometimes in the same street. I was just saying to somebody in the break today, you can stand in one corner of the street in Islington and look in one direction, you've got a new office block or high-end luxury accommodation, and you look on the other side and you've got a council estate right next door to it. So Islington's a place of stark inequalities. As a local Labour administration, we recognised this straight away, and we were the first council to set up a Fairness Commission. And that Fairness Commission reported in 2010, and it said that there are two Islingtons. On the one hand, we're home to some of the most wealthiest people in the country, the central London economy, including, we've got the Tech City cluster. It profoundly affects the distributional factors in Islington. 60% of all jobs in Islington are concentrated in two wards in the south of the borough, and they border the City of London. And what we've had is successive central government policy and traditional urban economic development that's promoted a developer-led growth in both our housing and commercial property markets. The financialised property market has resulted in sky-high land values and rents in Islington. So some parts of the borough have seen significant increases in economic growth and affluence, but the price of everything has skyrocketed. And what that means is that local people can't afford things, which means that they get forced out and they get displaced. And also our small businesses can't afford their rents and their business rates. So The term gentrification was used to coin what was happening in Islington in the 1960s. Over the decades, I think it's taken on different manifestations, and we're entering into quite a particular type of gentrification at the moment, which is spurred on by the financialised property market. And I've really got a problem with placemaking. Placemaking and public role improvements, don't get me started on that, and especially when it's being spurred on by transport improvements as well in London. Those placemaking initiatives, sometimes that are connected in with culturally led regeneration, which I know I'm going to annoy lots of people by having said the culture sector, but sometimes the way that it's done really does result in increases in land values, and it pushes forward gentrification. And I think the whole thinking around culture and how culture is being used by property developers and neoliberalism, actually, it really does need to be addressed. So on the one hand, you've got all this gentrification and affluence, but Islington, as I think pointed out earlier on today, we've got the second highest rate of child poverty in the country. And the vast majority of children, they do live in out-of-work households, but our most recent data is showing that there's an increasing number of children living in households that are where parents are working. So it's highlighting the insecure nature of the labour market, poor employment rights, low wages, and reduction in welfare benefits and payments to our low-income residents. And amongst all of London boroughs, in Islington, we have the highest proportion of our residents, our working age population, claiming sickness and disability benefits. So the picture, therefore, is that you've got increasing a situation where local communities are feeling, and businesses, feeling increasingly alienated from the changes that are taking place around them. Lots of our residents from our council estates have very little interaction with these high growth areas. They don't have access to the housing there because they're priced out, and the job market there isn't particularly accessible either. So just to say that in terms of nationally, because what I really liked about was Luke from IPPR this morning talking about London and the rest of the country. In Finsbury Park Ward, we have a super low output area that's in the top 3% most deprived in the country. So I don't think it's so much about London and the rest. I think it's about the 1%, wherever you are, benefiting from the disproportionate resources and how they're allocated. And also the key thing for us, like most inner London cities, is that yes, it's a problem of inequality, but it's a problem of inequalities as well, because we know that wealth is structured along class, race, and it's gendered as well. Poverty and inequality are structured and shaped in different spaces by the intersection of class, race, gender, disability, and other inequalities. And going forward, I think the community wealth building agenda needs to pay attention to that as well. I think that's a bit of a gap, because we sometimes talk at quite a local macro level, but how do you really reach into the communities? And that for us in Islington is part of our economic democracy challenge in Islington. How do we get into our estates, and how do we get to residents so that they can benefit? So about wealth building, how does it deal with the structural inequalities? So we know in Islington the current economy is dysfunctional, it's unfair, it delivers inequality and continues to harden poverty. It's not an economy that delivers for all our residents, and it's not an economy that's driven by the principles of economic and social justice. So what we've been embarking upon is looking at community wealth building, looking at developing an inclusive economy, and I think what's really another key area for the wealth building, community wealth building, is to really understand how wealth building can be articulated in different spaces, in different ways, depending upon the nature of the local economy, depending upon local political and radical traditions, which means that some places will take up certain interventions more than other places. If you look at the examples of Preston and Islington, you'll see that what we do is different. but we're still on the same community wealth building journey. So what we did when we started on this, in terms of formally looking at community wealth building, we said, well, as a local authority, what is it that we should be doing? And the main thing that we saw that we're a very important economic agent. The council, in terms of the public pound, it has a lot of power. And I think we need to step up and say we're going to use that power. Because I think prior to that, what local authorities do, they tend to underplay their economic power. But it's about saying, well, actually, you know what, we're going to really intervene economically in our local area. And so it's looking at how we directly deliver public services, it's looking at how we're a good employer, it's looking at how we use procurement to deliver jobs, apprenticeships, and also support small businesses in our supply chains. And so when we looked at it, we saw that actually we've been taking services back in-house since 2010. So since 2010, we've taken back in our housing management service. All these were contracted out under the previous administration. Our housing management service, our education service, our refuse collection, street cleaning, and most recently our housing repairs. We set up our own energy company in 2017 because we wanted to provide cheaper energy prices. Most of you know about Nottingham and Robin Hood Energy. We work with Robin Hood Energy as well. We're about to establish a new build housing company that will work in partnership with our neighbouring boroughs. Islington's quite kind of dense and small. We don't have large areas. We don't go into estate regeneration in the way that some other places have done, so we tend to do infill. So we tend to build lots of small sites of housing, and we're thinking that we think there's lots of problems with the construction sector. Why don't we as a local authority step up, provide our own apprenticeships, and basically control how we build houses? Because essentially, bringing it back in-house, we're better placed to provide those services. We're more responsive to residents' needs, and we're publicly accountable. That makes sense for us to do that. We're also a good employer. Islington was the first local authority accredited London Living Wage Council with Regeneration in 2012. And we've managed to get nearly all of our contractors to pay the London Living Wage as well. I think there's just one small bit within the social care sector that we're just finding it tough, but we're working on that, and it's really annoys us that we haven't managed to get that one yet. On procurement, we've got a lot to learn from Preston. We thought we were fantastic, we realised we weren't. So we set up a task force just before the summer with senior officers, social value task force, just to basically look at the whole way the council was commissioning and procuring its services and how we could build social value within that. We've got a lot to do with anchor institutions. We've realised we need to build our confidence internally in-house first. We've started to talk to the local hospital. That's mainly around workforce development, trying to get more nurses, etc. But that's a really good basis that we're planning to then have conversations around, well, how are you delivering social value through your procurement system? How can we help you? And we see that the role as the council is playing that kind of facilitative role. We're thinking about what do we do with some of the private. We've got very large corporations. And so we're having to think about what we do. Obviously, we're pushing for the London Living Wage, that they become London Living Wage businesses, but we're thinking about other ways that we can also encourage local corporations to deliver better practices. But one of the key things I want to talk about, I haven't got much time left. Okay, really quickly. Is another area where I think in terms of the community wealth building agenda that needs further looking at is the local wealth building is constrained by national government policy. And what do we do to shift national government policy, and particularly for us, as I've mentioned, the financialisation of the property market. So for us, planning and housing is really important, because in London, if you want to tackle poverty, you have to get on top of the housing crisis, or the lack of genuinely affordable housing. Because in London, in Islington, when a property developer wants to develop something, they're not competing. Islington's not in competition with the rest of London or with the UK. We're in competition internationally because there's serious money to be made. So we're quite robust in our planning policies. I'll just give you a quick example of what a local authority can do if you're minded to do it, is that we had a site that was owned by the Ministry of Justice. They sold it at quite a high price. The developer came along and offered no affordable housing on that site. Out of, I think, over 150 units. Our housing policy is that over a certain number of units, you have to give us 50% social housing. So when it came to planning committee, we threw it out. They came back 2 years later, gave us about 5 units, and we threw it out. They took us to appeal to the planning inspectorate, but the planning inspectorate upheld our decision. And then the developer took us to the High Court. And the High Court found in our favour. But what that shows you is how developers are determined to get what they want. We stood firm, and we were very fortunate in that the judge was really clear to say to the developer, you knew that local authority's policy was 50% social housing. So you cannot overpay, because what the developer was arguing is it's not viable to deliver social housing because of the price of land that they initially purchased it from. So, but they're saying, well, don't overpay for the price of land. So what I love about that example is that it became case law because the judge said that national guidelines had to be changed. But you have a local authority intervening in the market to constrain land values in that way. It's quite a small victory, but I think it's quite an important victory. But we're doing similar things with affordable workspaces as well, in that we're writing it within our planning policies to secure a certain amount of affordable workspace on all developments, but to get that for free from the developer over a minimum of 10, 20 years. And what we do is that we build in social value, and we get that affordable workspace for free from the developer. I don't have any time to talk about anything else. But just to say that finally, what Tad was talking about the workforce, one of the areas that we have been developing is how we support residents into work, and that's one of the key issues that we don't normally talk about in community wealth building. But again, it's about how you make it relevant to people and connecting the estates to the local economy. And finally, I would just say, it's how you scale it up. How do you scale up community wealth building? Either, like if we work with our neighbours, which are Hackney and Haringey and Camden, with our local hospitals, but generally, how do you generally scale up in terms of policy? Thank you.
So, friends and comrades, I think today's been absolutely brilliant. And I think in a way it shows the momentum that the Community Wealth Building Commission, inspired by Preston, has helped to build. And in a way, responding to Asima's point about scaling up, I think we shouldn't think about scaling up. I mean, we are here scaling up, but actually we're doing it by, somebody talked about horizontal, we're doing it by spreading, by connecting, so that we all meet each other constantly, but we don't just have beer and whiskey, but over the beer and whiskey. We actually sort of always, out of it comes some new move, some new connection, some new relationship. So I think something is happening that everybody here feels like a team that we're developing. I don't feel very legendary, partly because I spent most of last night, well no, a good part of last night, I don't think so, sort of sitting in stations across the country. But I do feel very, very stimulated. And I was preparing this on Sunday, feeling rather gloomy, because there were pretty dreadful opinion polls, and I feel completely paralysed by the Brexit sort of debate. But I was thinking, when I was preparing, I was thinking, actually, community wealth building is like a great source of optimism. And it's not, I think actually, when I was talking about what is the character of this optimism, it's not sort of, well, everything's going to be all right, everything's fine, Jeremy's going to get in and we've got community wealth building and so on. But in here I slightly disagree with Gramsci, that's rather, slightly risky thing to say. But it's not like optimism of the well-will and pessimism of the intellect. Actually, optimism comes from the intellect, because I think the reason why I'm so optimistic, or community wealth building gives me this optimism, is because through the experience of bringing together all these different sources of public value, of democratic control over the economy, we can begin to see through experimentation, we begin to develop the knowledge that can overcome the problems of the old economy and develop the new. So actually, optimism is coming from that knowledge that we've got the tools to overcome the problems, and I'll try and expand that a bit. I mean, I actually thought, I was so stimulated that I thought it was better to talk more building on what people have said than a sort of great new paper. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Maybe just a bit more about my own relevance to this topic. I mean, I come from Yorkshire, from Leeds, and anybody who comes from Yorkshire or Leeds knows that, you know, the idea of the local is ingrained into you. So I was brought up to really hate London, even though I'm sort of suspicious of Lancashire. I ended up getting a job in Manchester. And I've now ended up in fucking London. She actually kind of has a bit the same pride as you have when you're in Yorkshire, with due respect to Islington. Well, we do actually work with Islington, and we're trying to develop with Asima and Islington some kind of London-wide collaboration. But then I worked for the GLC, and that did kind of, I mean, there wasn't a mayor. It was like the GLC before Blair, before mayors. I think it was you that said the mayor of London. It was Livingston as the leader. Yeah. And, you know, that taught me what local government was like. Because I suddenly, after, you know, being inspired by Livingston and Mike Ward and their very detailed economic strategy, ended up as a local government officer. And what an officer, I thought, oh, I never thought of myself as an officer. And it was very hierarchical. So this is really to back up this idea of being in and against the state. From the day we arrived, we knew we were against it. I mean, partly it was even the physical building was hierarchical. So people like me and Sheila Robotham and a few sort of scruffs, we'd be sort of walking up to see Mike Ward, our political boss, and somebody would say, "What are you doing up here?" You know, sort of like, "Are you a senior officer? No, are you a chief officer?" No, but, you know, we kind of working with Mike Ward. And we were just, it was all the time antagonism. We had a senior sort of bureaucrat who was working with us, but actually completely undermining what we were doing. And here we had the key point, which I'm sure Matthew would in himself, he personifies the importance of political will. So Livingston and Mike Ward and the majority of councils are completely behind our economic strategy, which included setting up a popular planning unit, setting up an investment bank, ideas which are considered completely off the wall. But, you know, they were completely behind it. In fact, they'd spelled it out in their manifesto. And they just had the political will to say, right, that officer goes. So she wasn't actually sacked. I think she was removed, you know, not to the mortuaries and things, but I think to some lower level of of London transport where she was under full control. Anyway, then I worked for the TNI with Satoko, and in a way we're trying there to... Our first director actually was in the IND government. He got assassinated, actually. I mean, well, I'm not saying that Satoko and I are under threat, but it just illustrates that the TNI is about political engagement, is about work with movements. It is like Claire's and like the new IPPR, a think and do tank. But anyway, I'll move on to what I really want to say. So I think the key thing is this idea that that the old model has failed, and community wealth building is about building the foundations of a new economy. I completely agree with Matt here, and I do feel really strongly that it is the basis of a new kind of socialism. And in that sense, it's in conflict. It's in a context of conflict. It's not some new third way. It's actually in a struggle. I mean, Hackney, like Islington, is absolutely, you know, it's in a conflict. I mean, Hackney hasn't yet gone as far as Islington, but it well could. You know, when I go to the Olympic pool, as it happens, in Hackney Wick, and I cycle through Hackney Wick, there's a big poster which says, "From shit house to penthouse." You know, that's what's happening to Hackney Wick. It was a sort of place of artistic, you know, creation in the sort of old warehouses that were taken over and turns into squats. I wouldn't say shit houses, but anyway, and now it is completely, you know, penthouses, completely unaffordable. And I mean, Phil Grenville and other Hackney activists and so on are beginning to do something about this, so good on them, but they are in a conflict. It's not a sort of third way of compromise, it's actually a struggle and a conflict, and that's what I want to talk about a bit more. And I think here, just to draw very quickly and build on what Martin said about what we're talking about is building a kind of concept of the state and society that's beyond that, well, not beyond, but against that sort of abstract notion of the state versus individuals, not versus, but and individuals, which is kind of the state and the market, and is sort of a concept which can underpin neoliberalism. But in building beyond that, I think we're challenging two models that still kind of are in the political culture. One is the social democratic model, which is the idea that you redistribute the products of the private sector of capitalist wealth. So essentially, you not only leave capitalism untouched, but actually you almost protect it. That's what we saw under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. You protect wealth, private wealth creation, and then you redistribute the result. Or you redistribute it to a point, up to a point, i.e. a point where it doesn't challenge capitalism. And I think secondly, it challenges the idea, another sort of feature of Blair, and I do think we are still having to kind of slough off the legacy of Blair and Mandelson. But I think we're challenging the idea of civil society as completely neutral, a sort of big society model. I mean, Frances, in a way, touched on that with her notion of civil society and the solidarity economy as a sort of political idea. You know, that idea that somehow civil society doesn't challenge either the market or the state, that it's a kind of neutral sort of area, a camouflage and a kind of comfort blanket, an alternative to real political struggle. So, I mean, I think in trying to analyse how is it that community wealth building is not that, what is it, what are its key features that underpin its subversive but alternative vision. I think one is what was mentioned by Neil, which was this idea of, you know, what all these different initiatives, whether it's procurement, community land values, cooperatives, potentially trade unions, I think there's a lot to be done there, and it's a pity we haven't got trade union people here. I think that's something we've really got to work on. It's not going to be easy either. But I think what they have, what brings them together, what underpins their commonality, is this idea of public value, of use value, you could say. The idea of public value is distinct from maximisation of profits, so maximising public benefit at every point, and social justice. And I think that means we're repoliticising, because the key feature of Blair was to depoliticise economics, technocratise civil society, and we're trying to repoliticise, not in a sort of sectarian party sense of everything being under the control of the Labour Party, but in terms of values, the economy and society. And that's really about a new politics that we need to, that's new, that's emergent, as some people have said, and therefore we need to be consciously self-conscious of it in order to think through where it's going, where it could go, what are the obstacles. I think that not only are we faced with that sort of technocratic culture that's still a legacy from Blair and Manson, I think here, you know, we can see it's infused the trade unions to a point. So I used to work with, firstly, trade unions in manufacturing against arms conversion, the Lucas Aerospace alternative, which seems to be reviving in very encouraging sort of ways, but very different circumstances. But, you know, that was about shop stewards, designers, some of the most, you know, advanced designers like Mike Cooley and engineers, you know, internationally. But they understood that technology and production was absolutely imbued by values. It was the result of political, social decisions, and that included the work, not just the nature of arms production and the fact that it was for arms production, but the purpose, not only the purpose, but the methodology, the ways in which technology was designed. And in a way, the trade unions have lost that I mean, not that that was a mass phenomenon, but it was significant. There's not just them. There was initiatives in Vickers, Armstrongs, in Chrysler, in all sorts of different companies where trade unions took on the purpose and nature of production. And that's completely gone. So you saw, the way you've seen trade unions now, there's this danger that they've got sucked into a purely electoral politics. So they're very, Unite's very committed to supporting Jeremy Corbyn, and that's really good and really important. But, that's almost seen as in tension with, certainly in contradiction to, actually beginning to think through an alternative trade unionism, a trade unionism based on public values. So they backed off any idea of arms conversion vis-a-vis Trident and so on, because that would rock the electoral vote. Similarly, Unison, instead of fighting privatisation with an alternative vision of the public sector, a democratic and democratisation of the public sector, which some of its members at a local level have done, it's kind of don't rock the vote. We can't engage in sort of struggles in the build-up to an election. So I think we've got to work with the trade unions, because I think also to collaborate on a sort of value-driven trade unionism, which I think also then helps to overcome tensions with the cooperative movement, because then one can distinguish between cooperatives that are socially driven, that share the same values as local authorities, as Matt is doing in Preston, from those that are just a sort of thin end of the wedge of privatisation.
Yeah.
So I think that's crucial. I think the other basis of community well-being is what the duo Bertie and Keir said, the whole idea of commoning. And I think that is crucial. That's crucial to the whole nature of the whole possibility of transforming the state. It's not enough to talk about public. The public has been sometimes very alienating, very much above the people, and commoning is about actually, in practice, turning public resources into real common resources. But I think, in my 1 minute, I just say that I think crucial to that idea of commoning is treating human creativity as a commons, treating everyday knowledge as a commons. And I think that idea of knowledge and human creativity as a commons, as a shared resource, and as a basis of a different kind of society is really important, because the kinds of knowledge that have dominated the state as an alien sort of institution is knowledge purely as a sort of scientific set of scientific laws, which isn't to say we don't need that notion of knowledge. We do, but it's got to be rooted and combined with a recognition of the expertise that's based in practical knowledge, experiential knowledge, tacit knowledge, and I can explain more about that or discuss that later. But I mean, I think that's also, well, I was just going to quote, Tom Paine on this, because it's really inspiring. So he said, there is existing in man, I'd say, a massive sense lying in a dormant state, and then he talked about which will go to the grave unless it is excited. The construction of government ought to be such as to bring forward, by a quiet and regular operation, all that extent of capacity. I mean, he was saying that in moments of revolution, that creativity is evident, and you can see it in moments of struggle. I mean, Jonathan described it in effect in Dublin. I saw it in the movement of the women in the mining communities, where women who've been completely, in just reproducing the labour power of their husbands in the mines, suddenly became public figures, and their lives changed, and they were speaking internationally. They become really knowledgeable people. And so how we socialise, how we share that knowledge, that capacity, I think is crucial to the sort of participatory democracy that John MacDonald talks about. And then finally, just to illustrate with that, I think we've got to think, in our thinking about spreading or scaling up, how we connect the local initiatives, the local community wealth building, with the sort of participatory economics that John McDonnell and Jeremy are promoting. And I mean, and one example would be that I learned on my experience in stations last night was the idea, let's say John is talking very much about, worker control over the railways. Well, if you go to, firstly, in King's Cross, I was, in my hour waiting, I was chatting to a young beggar, and this official came up and said, you can't, she's not meant to be there, she must go, and I talked to him, and obviously he was alienated, he didn't necessarily agree with that, although he did at that time, but, that was like a policy, so that's, clearly any real discussion about the role of, hopefully there won't be beggars if we have a Labour government, but, the role of stations as a sort of social hub where all sorts of interactions can go on is something that needs to be changed. And then when I got to Leeds and I had to wait another hour, I was told you cannot wait beyond the ticket barriers, where I knew there was a nice warm waiting room. No, you have to wait in the kind of freezing cold sort of concourse, as it's called. And again, if you had a democratic process, so I was thinking, that we need, through different localities, to be thinking how to democratise stations, which is quite a big task that leads outwards beyond the particular locality. But I think if we take aspects of national public institutions, the kind of institutions that now need to be, or are going to be brought back into public ownership, and think how can we locally prepare for that. And that, my final point is that the point about community wealth building is that we can do things now. We've got to start both preparing for a Labour government, but also in a way engage in what we could call is the propaganda of practice. So by actually illustrating what a different kind of public ownership would mean, we begin to build up support for a Labour government. So it's a break from a traditional electoral strategy into a strategy of practice as part of building the argument. So the final thing is just to say this is really learning from Asima. So just to say that this is really, really urgent. I think that's come out in a number of contributions. This is urgent and necessary. So we've got to start working, not just, and Martin's been exemplary here, and somebody would say getting out of our rooms if we're academics, not just as a group of theorists who also combine with a bit of practice, but actually as people really working with a sense of urgency about how we create now the foundations of a new model and the foundations of a new government. Thank you.
So I've somehow contrived to come without any prepared remarks, any notes, plus I was out late drinking whiskey, and so unlike in Dan's case, if what follows is rambling and incoherent, and that's entirely down to personal shortcomings. So let me start just by thanking my old friend and comrade Martin O'Neill for pulling together this meeting. A lot of people have said this, but this has been an extraordinary lineup, a super group in Francis's phrase, and really, I think, happening at a very important moment for this movement as it comes to maturity and as it begins to feel its power and begins to move forward in a very important way for the future of the country and indeed for the left, or globally, internationally, I think. So this is an extraordinary gathering, and I'm just so impressed by all the colleagues and friends here and the amazing work that's being done on community wealth and the advances that have been made in just a very short period of time, and it really is encouraging. And so please take what comes next in that context. People have talked about optimism. Hilary just talked about optimism. Dan was talking about optimism. The optimism of Gar Alphabets, who's his mentor and mine in many ways, and has imbued our organisation with optimism, such that I would describe myself as a professional optimist. And I think that's very important at the moment because, frankly, to take a phrase from D. Ward Hawk, it's far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism. And what do I mean by that? I mean the crisis that is coming upon us, that has been touched upon, I think, by a few people here. We may not be fully grappling with the dimensions of that and the stakes that poses, I think, for this movement and this group and these particular strategies, because frankly they're the only game in town in terms of an alternative to a neoliberal economic paradigm. There's nothing else out there. It's us. We are the people that we're waiting for. If we're going to create an alternative, it's going to be done by this group of people and the people that we work with. And that's a pretty scary thought, because I have to say, if you look around the world at the moment, we are losing. We are losing badly. There is a neo-fascist international in power that stretches from Brazil to India, to the White House, to Italy, to Hungary and Poland and so forth. The big changes that are happening at the national level internationally all seem to be, not all, there's a few exceptions, Mexico is a bright spot, etc. But by and large, we're losing the battle. We do have the right ideas. Francis, I think, was exactly right in saying that we know what the program is now. We've had all these period of experimentation. I support your call for an era of experimentation, like Unger has been calling for. But we actually need to move beyond experiments now. We need to move beyond demonstration projects. We need to move beyond the notion that we represent the alternative and figure out a way in which we become the dominant paradigm, and become the dominant paradigm very, very quickly. We do not have much time. If you look at some of the publications that have been coming out in IPPR Progressive Review, Matt and Karis put together a very impressive issue on the Anthropocene. Matt mentioned some of the data in his presentation this morning. We've lost 2/3 of vertebrates already. 2/3 of vertebrates are gone. There's 60 harvests left. We've now got 12 years to bring about what the climate scientist Schellenhuber has described as a controlled implosion of the fossil fuel industry, and yet emissions are going up, and the power of the oil companies only seems to be growing politically. If you look at Trump and what's going on in Washington. So how do we begin to move from this posture where we need to, I think, embrace the sense that we have to take soon state power, and we have to start developing very hard-nosed strategies in a way that allow us to move from a collection of experiments and plural models and nice ideas and the power of ideas to something that can win. And I think the place it's most likely to happen is here in the UK, which is why, living in Washington, D.C., I'm here practically every month at the moment. This is the tip of the spear globally for creating a post-neoliberal new left economic paradigm that can meet the demands and the needs that we're facing in community after community, and deal with the ecological crisis, and really embed democracy and participation in the work that we're doing. People have mentioned the 30s. And I went recently when I was in New York to the Whitney, to the gallery there, and the curators had put together an absolutely extraordinary exhibit, drawing an amazing collection that they have. It was all organized around W.H. Auden's poem, September the 1st, 1939, which, if any of you know it, is a haunting poem about the collapse of the 30s into the Second World War, and all that represented. You must love one another or die, Auden says at one point in that line. And I think these are the stakes that we really need to be grappling with as a movement. It's us or it's no one. And frankly, the idea of failure and what that would represent is frankly terrifying. I wanted to mention the book that I just completed with Christine Berry, People Get Ready. So let me rob from that a little bit of the thinking on what strategy actually means at this point to really begin to enact transformative political economic change. We've got two examples from the post-war period. We know our history of Adam, and we know what was accomplished there. It wasn't actually an attempt to really move from capitalism to socialism in many ways. It was the creation of a mixed economy, done in a very hard-nosed way on the basis of a power analysis of those sections of capital which in the preceding decades had repeatedly pitched the British economy into crisis and caused major setbacks for the labour movement, the most famous of which, of course, was the general strike. And so, as well as some of the obvious industries that needed to be nationalised, there was also an analysis there of which sections of private capital needed to be liquidated, taken out, so that they could no longer disrupt the onward march of labour progress. And so that's what happened with coal, it happened with steel, etc. A very interesting sort of tour through that in the research that I just did for the book. A similar thing happened with Thatcher. We know, of course, of the way in which they identified the trade unions, and in particular the public sector trade unions, as the real enemy. And if you look at some of the documents that were produced in that immediate period before neoliberals came to power, we're all familiar with the early phase now of neoliberalism, of the Montpellerian society, which has become a sort of byword for how to start moving your ideas from the margins to the mainstream and to have a long haul sort of ideological program and plan. But there was also that second phase of neoliberalism, when they actually started to figure out what exactly they would do when they took power. You saw this with the Powell Memorandum in the United States, where Lewis Powell Jr., who just before he was nominated by Nixon to the Supreme Court, wrote a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which really set out in simple but powerful detail a plan for how to mobilize the business community to push back against environmentalists and to push back against the new consumer movement and to use jiu-jitsu tactics against the left, to learn from the successes of the civil rights movement and the environmental movement in law of the courts. And this then became what's been probably one of the most successful political initiatives, which is the law and courts movement that came out of the conservatives in the US on the right there, who have essentially taken over the judiciary from top to bottom now. It's going to be very, very difficult with the US Supreme Court the way it is and the backlog of judges that they've been able to put in place. And then another document along those lines in the UK was the Ridley Plan, which was produced in 1977 and laid out in very, very stark detail what needed to be done to denationalise, as they called it then, before they invented the buzzword privatisation that put a much more positive spin on things. But it was a very, very clear-eyed, hard-nosed look at the balance of power relations in different industries, areas where they thought there was absolutely no chance of being able to privatise, but there would be ways to introduce market features into those industries, such as requirements on returns to capital, incentives to managers, marketisation, etc. And then other areas where you could begin a salami slicing process of privatisation. And then there was the political annex at the end, which said, we're probably going to face a major industrial conflict. The guess was it was going to be coal. And at that point in time, there was no way to win a coal strike. And sure enough, in the very first years of the Thatcher government, there was the coal strike that never was in 1981. When it would clearly have been disadvantageous for the Thatcherites to have a showdown with the NUM because there wasn't enough coal stockpiled at the power plants and so on. But they asked themselves in a very rigorous way, how do we now start to do things today that change what is possible tomorrow? And had a really clear-eyed and far-sighted way of going about that. And then when you look at what actually happened with privatisation, I mean, it's astonishing the sort of double move there, similar to Attlee's, with sort of liquidating the private coal owners and incorporating those workforces into the basis of a new public sector workforce and a new mixed economy. It was the exact reverse. With the privatisations, not only was there a knockout blow against the public sector and working class communities, but there was also the fuel to build financialisation and to build capital markets. Extraordinary figures. When BT was privatised, it was it was 6 times larger than any previous stock offering that had ever been done in the UK, and 3 times larger than the global previous largest stock offering, which I think was AT&T in the United States. And Lawson had gone to the city and he brought the merchant bankers together and he said, how do we do this? And all but one of them said, this can't be done. You cannot float BT all at once. The total absorptive capacity of new stock issue in the London Stock Exchange in a year would be about 2 billion, and this was going to be 3.5 billion. And so he didn't take that for an answer. What he did was, it was almost a version of Mariana Mazzucato's entrepreneurial state. They used the need to create new financial mechanisms for flotation to drive what then became the powerhouse of the extractive economy in London and the city as we know it today. And that involved reforming the city. This sleepy old boys club of sort of white shoe firms and so on, and then suddenly it was opened up to the icy winds of competition and corporations were brought in, and so the really powerful way in which you can use a sort of jiu-jitsu move of on the one hand sort of breaking down the strengths of your opponents, but also using them to build up your new model. And I think that's how we need to be thinking about community wealth building and about some of these new economic strategies. If you like, there was denationalization was one side of the coin, and privatization and financialization was the other. What we need to do is reverse that. We need definancialization on the one hand, and the other side of that coin for us would be democratization. And so what does that mean? It means leveling down some of the institutions of the old model of the extractive economy. How do we begin to hem in big capital, finance capital, the big banks, etc.? How do we start dealing with this new era of monopolies that we've got with big companies dominating in retail and in banking and so forth? And then at the same time, how do we use those opportunities to really start to build up at scale and quickly the new institutions of the democratic economy that are needed? And so I guess I'm trying to sound the alarm and to issue a call to arms here. I think we need to become much more serious about ourselves and our own power and about the task that we have ahead. I think we need to become political. I think there's a double-edged sword to that. Anthony was talking about the strength that comes from sort of broad cross-party appeal of some of these ideas, and I think that's right. But Gar always talks about walking on two legs, and I think we need to walk on two legs with this. On the one hand, there are some people that are going to there'll be a division of labour, if you'll excuse the pun here, where some people go and do technical work and continue to work in a less political idiom. But I think a lot of us need to move into a much more political posture, without detracting from what Matthew and Neil and others have been able to achieve on the ground in Preston, which is extraordinary and important. In some ways, the power of Preston is the idea that it is unleashing, that there are real alternatives already in practice, and that we can start to move in the direction that Hilary was talking about at the end of her talk. And so I think I'll just wrap up there and sort of say, let's get on with it. The stakes are enormous. I mentioned Auden so at the beginning, so let me end with Auden, who, after all, is a son of York. There's that terrifying final stanza of his poem Spain, which goes, if I can remember it correctly, "The stars are dead, the animals will not look. We are left alone with our day, and the time is short, and history to the defeated may say alas, but cannot help nor pardon." We can't afford to be defeated, and we can't just take the alasses of history. We've got to make history. So thank you.
Well, making history got me for 10 minutes. The organisers for inviting me. I must say, I have to say this, and I want to be very clear about this. I'm speaking in a strictly personal capacity. Nothing I say should be taken as being what the Labour Party thinks, what John McDonnell thinks, what Jeremy Corbyn thinks. I'm speaking entirely for myself, and these are just my opinions only. So, with that proviso, I wanted to say a few things that pick up on what some of the panel have touched on, particularly Hilary, who has unfortunately, I did actually try to write some notes, but you've covered most of it, so I'm going to have to revise things a bit and maybe see if there's a bit of a kind of point of tension there, which is this issue of the intellectual challenge that I think we're up against. Because I think by this point, by the time Jeremy Corbyn has been leader of the Labour Party for 3.5 years, since September 2015, having got through the election last year, and with the sensational results that we produced, not quite winning, we'll have to do that next time, but nonetheless a sensational result and demonstration that these ideas are popular and that this is going to work. I think this point about seriousness is exactly where we need to get to from here onwards. And part of that seriousness, I think, is understanding the intellectual challenges of what we're trying to do. Because I was reminded, it's something that Fab mentioned about market socialism, which reminded me, probably more than 20 years ago now, picking up a book in Colchester Library in Essex. Alec knows the economics of feasible socialism, which people might recognise. And it is literally about 20 years since I read it, but it's stuck in my head, and I might be misremembering this, but it's stuck in my head as I think it said in the book, which is, Alec writes that there is a market. If you're talking about organising the economy, he says there is a market, and there is a hierarchy, and there is nothing in between. Right? So that's quite a blunt statement of how we might think about what an economy is doing and what the possibilities are. There is a market, and that gives you a price, and there's competition, and this is trade, and that's what you have. Or there is a hierarchy. There is something like a government that tells you what to do, and that's that. And there is nothing else. Now, the reason I think that this is a challenge is that, first of all, you can see, obviously, if you're kind of neoliberal, one of the, I think it's a brilliant development, actually, the way in which neoliberal has become an insult. And the best thing about it, there's a kind of clique of really angry centrist ads on Twitter who spend a great deal of time denying it even exists. Particularly good. But if you're a neoliberal, you could easily agree to the statement, yes, there is a market and there's a hierarchy, market's better. Right, and we can all say, yeah, that's fine. We can see that that's bad and wrong, we disagree with that. The challenge for us on the left is the flip side, which is saying, if you take the kind of post-war social democratic view of what the left is doing, it's saying there is a market, there's a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is better. The state is better at doing these things. And the challenge I think we have now is in actually breaking that duopoly of what you could organise, which is of course what's been discussed all throughout the day. Breaking that and winning the intellectual argument, you can break that, I think it's meaningful to break that. Getting out of the binary between market and state as the only two possible options for how a left might function and why you might do that. And I think the reason to do this is in two parts. The first one is something people have touched on, and something that John McDonnell has talked about, when Labour gets into power, it wants to make its changes irreversible, which it's another one for Twitter that people get very excited about, and it's a terrible, sinister thing that's going to happen. And all it really means is it's a sort of Gramscian point, which is, look, take an example. The NHS was set up in 1948. 48. Set up in 1948. It's still there. It's immensely popular. It is established, and I wish I could remember, I'm going to blame the whiskey who made this point to me last night. It's established almost a sort of constitutional point of health being a right for people in this country. And it's immensely well supported, and it's extremely hard to envisage any government to actually just turn around and say, hey, do you know what? It's in our manifesto, we're going to get rid of the NHS. You know, you can see successive Tory governments spend a great deal of time working out how to try and get rid of the NHS without actually saying we're getting rid of the NHS. It's an immensely popular institution. To that extent, it is irreversible because it is built in that lots of people support the damn thing. Now, the challenge that we face, I think, if we're serious about having a transformative government, is saying that we want the changes we make to be irreversible in the sense that they'll remain popular and that we defend those changes. Because if I look at the record of the last Labour government, they actually did quite a lot. And by the way, I mean, maybe this is a controversial point. I think it's better to put Blair and Brown closer to the tradition of social democracy than to say they're just neoliberals or whatever. Really, because they redistributed enormously. You know, relative to previous Tory governments, redistribution by New Labour did happen on a significant scale. And there's a whole, by the way, there's a whole sort of tedious subset of again, people on Twitter mostly. I spend much too much time in it. Who will argue that this was a very radical government because it redistributed so much. Because they're trapped by this logic of market or hierarchy. And they did lots of redistribution from a market that was chugging away over here. Now, to be honest with you, this is an aside. You can easily argue that if you're doing lots of redistribution, this is not a sign of your success. This is a sign of your failure. Because if you had an economy that was working properly, you wouldn't need the redistribution. And that's the point that we have to get to. That we have to build in the institutional changes that have the popular support, that mean the economy works in the first instance for the people, so you don't need later the state to turn up and redistribute and make everything work to a sort of minimally acceptable standard. And how do you make institutions popular? That if you look at the record of what New Labour introduced, and it did involve creating new institutions, the Child Trust Fund, Sure Start Centres, there's probably a couple of examples I can think of. What happened to them? As soon as they changed the government, they went. Now, all right, people probably like these things to a greater or lesser extent, but there was not the fight to keep those things in place and to make them permanent. And I think part of the issue there is because they weren't won. It was just, here is the government, here is something it's going to give you. It wasn't built from the ground up. And it wasn't the government facilitating these things happening. It was simply the government turning up and giving you some stuff. So if we want to make changes permanent, it has to be something that people have won and fought for. And the role of government is to facilitate that change rather more than it is to simply give people something. Of course we're going to end austerity, of course you're going to stop the cuts, but if you're talking about building new institutions, this is at least a process from the ground up, which is why when we talk about local democracy and what happens on the ground, it's so critically important to everything we're doing, because that's how you start to make the change permanent. The other part, and this is looking ahead and starting to get into, I think, the sets of challenges that are going to come bearing down as they already are bearing down as, but with increasing and unavoidable force over the next few years. The challenges, in particular, of climate change, the need to decarbonise the economy, the challenge of the Matt and a few others have touched on, of the data economy and the rise of data in the digital world. This information space is something that also creates new sets of public policy and economic challenges. But a lot of these things are not easily dealt with, either by saying, here is a market that will organise this new challenge, that will do something to address climate change, to build a new sort of data economy, or by saying, here's a government that will simply turn up and correct everything for you and make the world a better place in some sense. So take climate change. If you wanted to rapidly decarbonise Britain's energy system, that given that we live in basically a sort of small, wet, windy island, the obvious technology to use is wind power. The most rapid way you can get that wind power spread throughout the country is to give local communities ownership of it, because then instead of you just turning up as whichever large company is saying, here's a wind farm, thank you very much, we're taking the profits, you're giving something back to people, you're giving them ownership, and you are rapidly moving to decarbonise the energy system of this country. Now that does not involve a market or a state, a central government, that involves something from the ground up. That's how you start to do it. And if you take the issue of data and the digital economy, and this is not something I think that we've got necessarily very far into, and it's one of the challenges that we're bumping up against. It is not clear to me that some of the solutions you might suggest for what you do about the data economy and its domination by a few very large companies are sort of the traditional left-wing things you might do. You occasionally see people flippantly suggesting we should nationalise Facebook. Now, there are two sort of issues that. One, like it's in America, so we can't. Two, do you really want the US government to also own Facebook? so you sort of see the problems here. Now, getting into what we do about that, I think the spaces open up around the ideas of community wealth building, around the ideas of something that isn't just the market or hierarchy. That you can get into, for example, the work of thinkers like Eleanor Ostrom, who I don't think has actually turned up today, but I think it's quite an important person to consider the work of, and to get into that detailed understanding of how commons have existed throughout history, how you actually build these things. But these are the sets of ideas that we have to fight for, and these are the kind of the ground that we have to break, and the intellectual arguments I think we have to win about the kind of world we want to build. That starts to look like a genuinely feasible socialism, a genuinely transformed economy, one that works, as he said, for the many, not the few.
I told you, didn't I, that this was an unbelievably good panel, and it was. We've got this room for like 7 more minutes. Matt, if you need to drive to Preston, no one would hold it against you if you made a quick...
Well, 7 minutes ain't going to change.
So I'll just very quickly take a few questions, and I'll just let our panellists say a couple of words to finish, and then we'll wrap up, because this is already later than anyone would have expected to be here. So the floor's open for very quick questions, and then we'll get a couple of final thoughts. Neil McInerney.
I used to say, what do we do Monday? What do we do Tuesday? What do we do tomorrow?
What do we do on Tuesday? What do we do tomorrow? Fantastic. Other questions? Lady over there?
Yeah, I'd be interested in any thoughts the panel has on how some of the ideas we've discussed today might apply in rural areas. We've inevitably talked about cities a lot, but I mean the wage, the wage housing cost ratio in rural areas is often much worse. Crumbling social services, so gentrification, all those problems are there too. But of course, it's more sparsely populated. There's all sorts of issues. But I'd just be interested in your thoughts on what might be happening and what might be possible.
Okay, any more?
Role of charities and all this.
Role of charities. That's the kind of very sharp question. Yeah, chap over there, and then Abby there, and then we'll go back to the panel. Yeah.
You said that sort of we are the people that are going to have to sort of produce the change we want to see, and I think that's quite an interesting point. Obviously, it feels like a lot of this sort of conference has coalesced around Renewal Journal, but I was sort of wondering how, just out of interest, how do you see some sort of political centre perhaps coalescing around the sort of ideas being discussed discussed in this room, and how do you see this sort of discussion as a project continuing into the future?
I fully endorse the mention of Renewal Journal. Look at the hashtag local justice. There's a link to subscription, very well priced and full of amazing ideas. Right, Abby, then Fad, and then we'll go to the panel. Abby?
If we're on a journey to market socialism, and part of what's important in that is civic activism and I suppose these other methods to get there, is sortition a waste of time? Is it just sort of a civic conceit, this idea of developing citizens' assemblies and sort of like representative boards, make decisions? We've heard about that from a couple of different speakers today.
Right, so
is that a moral compromise?
So sortition, citizens' juries and mechanisms like that. And final question, Pat Williamson.
Excuse me if I missed it, but I don't think the question of race and immigration in the UK context has been addressed today at all. And so if Joe's right, this is the country where community wealth building is going to gain real power first. I think that would be important to consider.
Right, so race and immigration, huge questions. I'll pass the mic to the end. You have 1 minute each to say whatever you'd like to say.
The issue of democracy, it picks up on Dad's question as well. I'm probably going to, I'm a bit command and control still. And it picks up on your question about that it has to be political and some of the challenges around horizontal organising. I know this goes against the tide totally, but and it picks up. So I'm a council for Finsbury Park Ward. It's got a very diverse community, over 60% black minority ethnic community. The community organisations, the people that community organise are white and middle class. So how do you get democracy when there's issues around structural inequalities, power, and around power? Who has voice? So I don't see how. So I take a very pragmatic approach to all of this. So I'm an elected representative. Again, I'm rambling slightly. It's about how the Labour Party organises. I'm a Labour Party member. I'm a Labour Party councillor. How do we get better at the community participation aspect of things, and how do we get better representation of all communities? Because currently a lot of the social movements are not representative at all. I'm just going to...
Great, thanks very much.
Okay, maybe to build on that. So I think a key idea about democracy is debate and argument, and this idea that debate and argument produces knowledge and produces ideas, and experimentation produces ideas. And I think applying that to the immigration issue, I think that Corbyn's Labour Party had it right. I'm not quite sure where it is now, but had it right in the sense of addressing the economic insecurities that underpinned a sort of fear of immigrants and a kind of emergent racism, and that by addressing questions of low wages, by insisting on minimum wage legislation, by addressing housing, by addressing all the sort of basic social issues that underpin the insecurity of many of the and sort of anxieties of many of those that supported racist views. I think he's addressing part of the problem. And then if people are in a secure state, then one can have arguments and debate with leadership. I mean, I don't think leadership is the same as command and control. And in a way, I think you're talking about political leadership, which I think is really important in any sort of context of debate. So, I mean, I think just on the sortation, the by lot idea, I mean, I think it could have a role. I mean, because I think that does produce argument and debate, and it does mean that there's a valuing of the knowledge and capacity of ordinary people. And I think that's fundamental to going beyond the bipolar. Because actually, if you look at the bipolar, if you look at Hayek versus the all-knowing state, that bipolar is based on two opposing understandings of knowledge. On the one hand, the sort of codified knowledge that only the experts can know, and on the other hand, the tacit knowledge, which in Hayek's view and underpinning the market is individual. And what social movements and the sort of new left have developed with all the limits of social limits, is the idea that that tacit knowledge can be shared, can be the basis of political purposeful action, i.e. not the market, but of an uncertain and unpredicted way. So having to build experimentation constantly into it. And I think that sortation could be one element. You could imagine certain institutions, even maybe the House of Lords, or certain institutions being based on lot. But I don't think that can be the whole thing, because I think that that's a bit arbitrary about what kind of experiences, what kind of practical knowledge it reflects. So I think there's got to be a more structured, more, if you like, rooted kind of participatory democracy. So I think I better stop there.
Yeah, I'll try to answer all the questions at once. It's not going to be easy. On the issue of responsibility, I mean, we could all pretty much do a lot. I mean, say for example, if you're in a political leadership role like myself, firstly you need to put these ideas forward as the mainstream what you're doing, and also what is interesting as well is I think a lot more Labour leaders in local government are on this agenda as well. So that's the first thing. And why not consider even standing for a political position yourself? Get involved. Second thing is, it's what we do as investors, and say you're a member of the trade union, why don't you, say you're a Unison member, you could go to your branch and say, well, I want to put policy forward to Unison that 10 or 15% of my pension fund, if you're public sector work, is out of the equity markets and into local communities. You can do things like that. You can divest your money from the big banks and into building societies and credit unions. You could even try and form a cooperative business with your friends. There are things that we can all do. And if you're working in a university or in a position of authority in senior management, you could, or on a board, be pushing for insourcing and pushing for living wage strategies and the rest of it. So there's things you can do, but I think it needs to be on that broad spectrum of an acknowledgement of what needs to be done and what kind of crisis we're in, and look at alternatives to it, because if we're going to be skirting around the edges, as I said before, we're just not going to get anywhere, because if you're born in a certain part of the UK, deprived area, you can expect to live to about 62, and if you're born in probably the richest part of London, you can expect to live to nearly 90. And that is one of the biggest human rights abuses you can experience. It's worse than being put in prison. And why is that happening? It's because of the outcomes of the economic model we have. So we need to find a way of changing that, and we've all got a responsibility to do that.
I'll pick up on this thing about sortition, which is, I have to admit, probably not having thought too much about it or enough about it, I think would be the point to make there. And also, I don't know, I don't think we're on a journey to market socialism. I think one of the things, maybe had more time I might have said this, one of the things that we should be doing is looking to remove the market as a mechanism for distributing stuff. As far as possible, as far as we can do that. Most obviously, from the last manifesto, removing education from the market and making university education free, that this is a point of sort of universal principle. And what we have now is the emergence of technologies that could, in theory, allow that to happen on a very large scale. This is a point of zero marginal cost production and near zero marginal cost production, that sort of thing. So I think that's kind of where we're trying to get to there. That doesn't mean that markets won't have a role, but I think increasingly we should think of them as a kind of social role. We want a market, because I was just talking to Ben and his friend about their campaign up in Tottenham to save a market there, because it performs a useful social role. It's a thing that is actually something we like doing because it's a nice social thing to do, not because we think it's a really super efficient way to distribute what society produces. But on sortition particularly, the example that springs to mind, and it's a really interesting one, is what happened in Iceland after the financial crisis 2008-2009 with the attempt to rewrite the Icelandic constitution by having a sort of random lot of various citizens who got together and produced what was actually a really good document, but then fell foul of a political process before it got moved into law and the rest of it. And I mention this because, and this is a bit of a tangent, but one of the things, Brexit has revealed many things about this country. One of them is that we're really bad at having any kind of debate about constitutional issues in any form, because this is like a massive constitutional issue, and we're spectacularly failing to really grapple with it very successfully. And probably one of the issues looking ahead and looking out to the economy as such is the need to address some of those constitutional changes and what a constitution of Britain would look like, and how we might think about those long-term, permanent institutional changes you want to make to this country that'll be popular and well supported and have some degree of support out there.
To take the politics questions,
there's a sort of paradox at the heart of Corbynism, which is that by accident they let us capture the Labour Party and the leadership of the Labour Party when the left was at its weakest ebb in many ways, and so we're having to that's leading to some weirdnesses. Like, we're having to reverse engineer a movement from the leadership, and we're having to use the fact that we've already got a fairly radical program of political economy to try and do popular education at the community level and through the party and build cadres, as John McDonnell says. And so I think in many ways we're sort of running very fast to try and close a sort of generational deficit in left thinking, and also to rebuild some of the institutions and practices that we used to know as a movement but that fell into decay during the long winter of Thatcherism and Blairism. And that's things like the political education function that the party needs to perform. And it's very interesting that Momentum now is starting to get active on the idea of how do we reactivate the political education officers in constituency Labour parties, and that the World Transformed is now also looking at, as well as doing these great, wonderful festivals of ideas that are rich, and is probably, I think it's the most exciting conference that takes place in the world that I know of at the moment in terms of left thinking. But they're also knuckling down to the idea that this needs to be year-round and not just one big annual event. This needs to be happening throughout the country, and we need to be creating discussion spaces, reading groups, a lot of the things that were sort of the bread and butter of the early Labour movement. So, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel on some of these things. It's just resurrecting them. Dan Hind has just been single-handedly trying to resurrect the political pamphlet, and for those of you that haven't read it, is the New Thinking for the British Economy series is really worth checking out. But that's done in a format that people can take and have discussions with small groups and so on. And so I think really sort of trying to build this milieu and sort of densify the movement and its intellectual understanding of what the project that to some degree has by necessity had to be created by a very small group of people in the centre who are overstretched, under-resourced, and frankly haven't been supported by academia and by many of the traditional think tanks. And it's very welcome news that things like Commonwealth and Autonomy UK and these new models of think tanks are starting to emerge. And so, you know, getting some funding support to them, I think, is really critical. Hilary mentioned the unions. I don't know where the unions are with their resources on the policy and political education development that needs to be done. It seems like trying to get blood out of a stone, and that's one area where they could make a big difference very, very quickly. So bend the ear of any local trade union officials that you know of. Just to end, Neil said, what should we do on Tuesday? My parents named me after Joe Hill, so my answer to that would have to be, what do we do on Tuesday? Organise, Neil.
The perfect note on which to end. I feel like this conference has kind of burst its banks quite a significant way. So, thank you everyone for coming. I hope you've all enjoyed the day as much as I have. I should just thank both the Faculty of Humanities and the Faculty of Social Sciences here at York. We've had cross-faculty support for this initiative. Thanks to the Humanities Research Centre for accommodating us. Thanks to Simon and the Centre for Urban Research, the Department of Philosophy as well, and the Independent Social Research Foundation. If anyone here is looking for a funder that's a fantastic funder for any projects, either for early career scholars in any interdisciplinary area within the social sciences, or for people at any career stage looking for projects, project funding in political economy, I think our friends from the ISRF left some literature there, so do pick those up on the way out. Thanks again to everyone, and I'm sure these conversations will continue, but it's been a great way to start the year, so thanks for